Hey witches, it's Lee and this is Do the Magical Thing, and I thought I'd have a little chat about queer magic, queer witchcraft, and how we can go about carving a little space for ourselves in the witchy sphere as queer practitioners. And now maybe you prefer the term LGBTQ+, maybe none of those categories actually apply to you and you're thinking, what am I doing watching this video? Well, hopefully it'll give you a different perspective, and hopefully it will be something that allows you to get comfortable with feeling a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. I think that's important so we can progress and learn something. Now, speaking of comfort, for my queer viewers, there will be mentions of homophobia throughout, and I think it's important to be open and honest, but it might be triggering for some, so just a heads up on that. Speaking of sort of experiences, I can only speak from my perspective. Queerness isn't a monolith, everybody's different, so this is just going to be my point of view, and maybe it'll resonate with you, maybe it won't, that's fine. Feel free to discuss things respectfully in the comment section below, or, get your own voice out there. Make a video, make a blog, do whatever. Now, my experience and my perspective is from a non-binary lesbian perspective, right? That's a lot of terms in one. So, non-binary essentially means that I don't really fit into the sort of man and woman category in terms of gender, right? I don't feel particularly like a woman and I don't feel particularly like a man. There's that kind of liminal space that I occupy, and this was a term that was really helpful to me because when I was younger there wasn't this term, or I hadn't at least been exposed to this term as such. And so when people used to ask me cruelly or just through ignorance, are you a boy or a girl, when I was growing up, and it happened quite frequently, I didn't really have an answer. I just would shrug. I just didn't know. So when non-binary came along, that was a really helpful category for me to go, yeah, that fits. And it's the best fit at present. Maybe there'll be a better term in the future, but right now it's the way that best explains what I am. I'm also a lesbian. I've been out for years, came out in my teens, and that's something that hasn't really changed for me. I've been happily married for 4 years, and that's exciting in itself because obviously, again, when I was younger, gay marriage wasn't a thing, and to have that right, I think is really important. Whether you choose to exercise that right or not, I think it's important that you have the opportunity to do that if it's something you want to do, and I recognise that that's a privilege. I recognise that being able to be married is something that not every queer person has, the right to in their respective countries. And, the challenge is people who aren't queer or don't, experience, or, who are existing in life just as the kind of norm, if you like. And it's worth saying that heterosexuality is not normal, it's just common. People who aren't used to experiencing homophobia can quite easily think that it doesn't exist anymore. Why do we need pride? Why do we need this stuff? Well, A, it's not just about the country you live in, it's about the world. And B, it does happen, For me, the most disappointing experience of homophobia was I was walking past a play park and heading towards a supermarket, right, just on my way to get a bit of shopping, and there was a little boy in the play park with his dad and his granddad, and the dad and the granddad were encouraging the little boy to shout homophobic slurs at me. Now, I was just walking along the street, right, and it didn't, I'd heard that slur before. It wasn't so much of a bother in terms of the slur, but it was the fact that they were teaching this young child, they were indoctrinating this child into hate at such a young age. And I was like, this is just not helpful, and it's just so damaging. And I just think people talk about, think of the children when it comes to queer people just having a peck on the cheek on TV. Let's talk about the straight people teaching their children to hate other people. So that was a disappointing experience. And, in day-to-day life, when it comes to public toilets, I've got pretty big boobs, right? Yeah. But I still push my chest out to emphasise them because I've got short hair. I tend to dress in quite a traditionally masculine fashion. Yeah, I'm quite butch. And I've been stopped before going into a toilet I've been stared at in queues, or I've had people walk in and then look at the sign and then look at me. It's all these little microaggressions, right? All these little moments of people imposing themselves upon me, just existing, right? I just need to pee, right? I'm just going to the toilet. I don't care about anything else at that moment other than finding a decent loo, right? So I think it's worth saying that this stuff still happens, right? It still happens. And it's important to not get to not forget the lived experience of people just because we have some more rights now. Now, obviously, with queer people, the world can be a bit of a hostile environment. And so when you come into a subculture like witchcraft and, you see these people being very much like love and light and, everyone's part of the earth and all this sort of stuff, you think, oh, great. There's some equality here. There's some focus on inclusiveness here. Brilliant. Let's get involved. Let's get on it. And so you enter the witchcraft sphere, and the challenge is witches are still human, right? Witches are still people with their own prejudices, with their own things going on. And for me, this is sort of one of my key points of this video, is that when you enter the witchcraft sphere, immediately you're confronted with a couple of assumptions, right? And this is for every witch, but especially for queer witches, it has more of an impact, I think. So you're confronted with the fact that you're meant to believe in deities of some kind, and religion can be a real issue for queer folks because, some people have had really shitty experiences of religion and of religious institutions. And so anything to do with the deity can be a little bit of a no-go, right? So there's an assumption that you have to be, happy worshipping deities. And not only that, but you have to be happy worshipping God and a goddess, right? Because they're leeching out of belief from Wicca. Publishers, authors, bloggers, everybody has a responsibility to stop conflating Wicca with witchcraft. Wicca is a religion. It's not the whole of witchcraft. Witchcraft is the umbrella that different traditions sit under. Traditional witchcraft, Wicca, whatever it happens to be, you sit under the umbrella. You're not the umbrella itself. And so this is where we have a responsibility to be absolutely clear, because I didn't get into the craft until later in life because I thought you had to believe in a god and a goddess, because there's no relevance to that for me. I don't see why I should celebrate a straight couple throughout the wheel of the year, You've got all the rights. You don't need any more celebrating, right? I get the concept of the fertility aspect. I get the concept of, the metaphorical aspect of it, right? I understand that. And I understand these are important beliefs for people now. I'm not attacking your belief. I'm attacking the assumption of that belief, the proselytization of that belief onto others. What you believe is up to you, right? But it's that thing of coming into this witchy sphere, thinking it's going to be nice and inclusive, then being told you have to worship a deity of some kind, a male and female, so very binary, right? This is the other thing. As a non-binary person, neither of those things are something I'm particularly interested in. And to be quite frank, I don't think that this gendering of energy and this gendering of kind of universal power, if you like, right, is helpful. Because when we say masculine and feminine, what we really mean, if we're talking about masculine, is assertiveness, right? Or we're talking about passiveness. We're talking about projective behaviour or receptive. We're talking about being the lover or the beloved, right? Those are all terms that you can use and be far more accurate, right? Saying something's got masculine energy is vague. It's inaccurate. It's not clear, right? So I think when we get clear, that's when we get to the real essence of witchcraft. And don't we always say as witches that words are very important? Words have great meaning and power. Well, then let's use our words very carefully. Let's be choosy and ensure that the power that is coming from them is as close to our intention as possible. So, yeah, coming into witchcraft sphere, it can be very disappointing as a queer person because you're like, great, more heterosexuality, more heteronormativity. And heteronormativity is a term, in case you don't know, that means that the default setting is straight, right? Man plus woman equals whatever, yeah? And unfortunately, a lot of our witchcraft now is informed by traditions and practices from times when it was less... obviously homosexuality-wise was either a criminal offence when these traditions first started, or it was something that was, certain founders actively wrote things that said you can't be a witch and gay, basically, or that gay people are, wrong, or that we are, I come across some really rubbish information from a prominent witch of that time. And whilst this is the thing for me, and it's difficult, isn't it? And I don't know what your perspective is, but sometimes I find it hard when people go, oh, it was just this, it was just the age you were in. It was just a sign of the times. Because there were people in those times fighting for people's rights. There were queer people in those times fighting for their rights and carving little spaces out for themselves in whatever way they could. So for me, I find it a little bit lackluster of an excuse to be like, well, it's just how it was back then. Not everybody was like that. And I think the challenge is, though, being charitable, anything that was witchcraft back then was immediately odd, and so trying to exclude anything else that could be picked on by authorities or otherwise was a little bit of a focus then, right? And I think that's a shame. Now, what happens from that point is that those traditions inform today, and Hermeticism is one of those things, if you look at the kind of the principle of polarity, right, especially in terms of sex magic, there's this whole thing about you need a male and female for the magic to work. No, you don't, right? Maybe it's a fantastic union for you, that works, right? But it's not, and I've had literal conversations where people have gone, you can't have sex magic because you're lesbian, because you're not plus and minus, essentially. What? No, right? And also, and this is something that in A Spell in the Wild, there's it's a brilliant book, Spell in the Wild. In that book, it mentions about focusing, when it comes to sex magic, on the pleasure, right? Not just this whole polarity thing, not this whole kind of creating this connection thing, but focus on the pleasure. That's where the power comes from, essentially. And, if you are a queer person, don't you get more out of it? Don't you, at different times, become the lover and the beloved? Isn't that more balanced? And I just think there's a lot more perspective that we could dig into there, rather than just going, someone wrote it way back when, so that's how it is. Because that's not really acceptable. That's fine if that's for you, mate, but not if you're trying to spread that onto everyone else. And this is the thing. Traditions often expand outwards, and things that are common because people seek to know a definite thing about witchcraft, when there's so much flux, it gets easy to say this is how it is, when actually no, it's not, right? So when you're entering that witchy space, you end up, to be accepted in certain spheres, you end up kind of compromising yourself a little bit, going, oh, okay, well, I suppose I will take this on, or I suppose that makes sense, or whatever it is. But I think it's not too long until you start questioning these traditions and going, actually, no, that's not quite right. And when you get more confidence in the witchy sort of lifestyle and the witchy knowledge and all that kind of stuff, you go, hang on a minute, this doesn't have to be this way. And then you can expand and you can create your own, craft your own practice. And I think, it's important to say there are inclusive and deliberately inclusive traditions, and things like Wicca have books written about them, about making it more inclusive, less heteronormative, and that's important. It's important to say that. I think, unfortunately, though, there are still people in comment sections, and I've experienced it myself, where they've mentioned about queerness and making certain rights more equal when it comes to gender, and there have been people who are just outright like, nope, or just straight up homophobic. So it's not an issue that's just resolved by a couple of books being written, but at least those books are being written. So what happens is, I've found this in two ways, like either you start to craft your own path, or people start to take on roles within certain covens, within certain traditions, and slowly queer it a little bit. Or they tend to sort of defend the heteronormativity because it's queer enough for them. And I think that's okay if that works for you, but I do think it's important to try and make sure we're recognising heteronormativity when it's not necessary, and to really offer an alternative to that and encourage inclusivity and encourage that progression. So I think what's funny is you find a lot of queer folks in these certain traditions, in these leadership roles, and part of me wonders, are these leaders are they, because they have a certain amount of status and, you know, a certain amount of history within these certain places, are they then not rocking the boat as much as they perhaps should? Now, I'm a solitary witch, you know, I'm not invested in terms of traditions or covens or, you know, anything like that. But I think it's, from the outside in, from that perspective, it's worth thinking, is there more you could be doing? And this, for me, is, you know, something that I think has come about more as a question as I've looked at queer witches and queer writers and been validated by their words and by their experiences. And it makes you feel like, yeah, I can say, you know, there needs to be more space here, or there needs to be another perspective here. And it's important to have access to that. So, you know, when we're mentioning book recommendations and things like that, there's so many books that have really archaic ideas about gender roles and are problematic when it comes to trans folks or whoever it is. You know, these books still get recommended, and it's like, has anybody read a book since the 90s in certain places? Like, come on, there's been some amazing books that will far better serve people now. And yeah, sure, we can look at these books as a great perspective on the progression of witchcraft or as certain traditions' history, like that's fine. But why are we still recommending these damaging and harmful books straight off the bat, right? With no disclaimers, with no nothing, just going, here you go, just enjoy that that dig in the side, you know? No thanks. So yeah, I feel like you enter traditions, you go in with hope, or you go into the witchy sphere with hope, you get some moments of disappointment. You either take on a leadership role and start to queer things, or you get to a certain point and you kind of just go along with the flow, or you craft your own kind of path, right? And you carve that out, or you create a slightly tweaked tradition. That's awesome, right? Do whatever it is that you can do and you're comfortable doing, right? This isn't a demand for you to do stuff, because queer people are tired, right? It's tiring being queer sometimes, because there's so much you have to justify all the time and so much you have to be aware of. And, you know, holidays, right? People go, oh, I'll go to this place, that place, the other place. I'm thinking, if I hold my wife's hand in those places, am I going to get arrested, right? That's my thought, not, oh, that'll be a lovely day, that'll be a lovely trip. Do you know what I mean? There's thought processes that happen that don't happen when you're, you know, straight. So questioning establishing traditions, I think, is just a part of growing up as a witch, and especially as a queer witch or a queer witch. And in terms of those established traditions, there's a few books I'd really recommend to you, and I've written them down so I can make sure I got it right. So, Casting a Queer Circle, Non-Binary Witchcraft. This is an example of a Wiccan who is changing things up to be more inclusive. You know, Sister Minai is the author, and that's been really interesting so far. I've been working my way through that. Queer Magic, Power Beyond Boundaries by Lee Harrington and Ty Phoenix Culliston. Now, that's a really interesting group of essays from different witches, including actually another author in there, or another couple of authors in there. And that's been great for really sort of having a broad perspective and a typically queer mixed media approach. So I've really enjoyed that one. And Queer Magic, LGBT Spirituality and Culture Around the World by Thomas Prower. That was really highlighting to me of how much history has been lost or unexplored. I'd really recommend this, because whilst it's not purely about witchcraft, and whilst it is male heavy, because there is less information, unfortunately, around women and their sexuality, it's really fascinating to see how much non-binary people, trans people, queer people in general have been celebrated as witches or shamans or as spiritual figures, priests and priestesses, and you know, to the point where they were there to give blessings to children and things like that. Now, if you think about the narrative of the West now and the narrative of modern times now about, you know, the terrible comparisons and slurs against queer people. If you think about that, it's fascinating to look back into history and go, no, we were accepted and we were part of an important cultural aspect of blessings, of all that kind of thing. So yeah, Queer Magic, LGBT Spirituality and Culture Around the World by Thomas Prower, very much recommend. Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture is something that I've been wanting to read. It's an older book. I think you can get it on Kindle mainly or as an ebook, but you can, in fact, get it from PBW Witch Shop, Alex Rec, their fantastic shop, which I always link below. And that's a really interesting one that I want to check out. It was written some time ago, so I can't vouch for, what it's necessarily going to be like in terms of tone, but it's definitely one I want to watch. Now, one I've been reading and been really thoroughly enjoying is Queer Magic. Not Queer Magic, is Queering Your Craft by Cassandra Snow. Now, they've done Queering the Tarot as well, which I really want to read. And yeah, Queering Your Craft, it's a book that I wish was around when I was younger. It's definitely something that made me think about my voice as a queer person and how much it's suppressed, how much it is, how much you just don't realise you've closed yourself in because you have to hide yourself so much. So Cassandra, thank you so much for that work. I think that it's a really important one to actually open yourself up as a queer practitioner, to be able to really engage with that voice. And it's so practical, very approachable, lots of tips and things to do, and really highlighted a whole aspect to queer witchcraft that I didn't necessarily think of before. So yeah, really valuable and worth reading. That is Queering Your Craft by Cassandra Snow. A more recent book. And as I say, this is the benefit really of these books. Another one that I'm looking at now and I've just bought is Outside the Charm Circle. And Outside the Charm Circle is something that I've found so far from the brief part of it that I've read has been really interesting in terms of, mentioning that witches who don't necessarily engage with the queer side of things are missing out, and I think that's really fascinating, because who would think that was a thing necessarily to say. I thought it was great, and this is what they say in the book. They say, my overarching thesis is that most modern forms of magical and devotional practice have valorised cisgender heterosexuality to the exclusion of all other expressions of gender and sexuality, and in doing so have cut themselves off from both the full spectrum of lived experience and the depth of magical practice. Now, as a queer person, that's revolutionary for someone to come in there and just go, yeah, you're missing out on that, and why would you want to miss out on that depth? And yeah, I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think that this book is very interesting as a real deep dive into gender and sexuality and sex and everything that you might want to try and explore as a queer practitioner in magic, but also just as in general, as a practitioner. So definitely worth looking at. That is by Misha Magdalene. And yeah, highly recommend. Really a thoroughly interesting work. It's also by Michelle Belanger. So yeah, worth having a look. All these books, because not every queer person has, is always in the money as such. You can read small samples of them. Even if you just read the free samples of these books, you're going to get some validation there. You're going to get some feeling of solidarity and of a little bit of a call to arms. I was looking over, what is sort of witchcraft and queerness, or what is it to be? If we're going to make our little pentagram, as we like to do, or as I like to do anyway, have our 5 points, yeah? Well, for me, queer and witchcraft, really, and I've summed it up as it's about queering magic and making queering those magical roles, right? Etching that place out. It's about community, about creating that community and trying to expand on it, creating space for people to feel like they can do what they want to do. It's about relearning history. Thank you, Thomas Prower, for that brilliant book on really digging into the fact that we have always been here, we've always been significant. Scott Cunningham was gay. Like, these are figures that have really formed important aspects of modern witchcraft. It's also about not only relearning history, not only queering magic and magical roles, not only community, but leading the way So leading the way into the future, into, in terms of those different traditions that we might be entering, covens that we might be entering, right? Making sure we're ensuring it's inclusive for everybody. Because the best thing as an LGBT person or a queer person, is that you can make sure that it's inclusive, not just for you as a queer person, but for people of colour, for different minorities. It's something that you can achieve. And that's so exciting because, and when I say you can achieve, this is not about a whole saviour complex thing, but it's about opening up the conversation and giving the floor to people who have different experiences of oppression who aren't highlighted. So it's leading the way and allowing and ensuring that those conversations can happen. And it is about activism, right? That's my final bit on the 5, the 5th element of the pentagram of queer witchcraft. It is about activism. It is about, where you can, highlighting, queerness, ensuring that we're making sure that everybody has rights and access to witchcraft and that everybody can feel included. Rights, really, when it comes to queer witchcraft, it's rights in 2 ways, isn't it? Yeah, it's rights as human beings, and it's rights as in magical rights, being included in that. So that would really be my kind of sum up, if you like, of queer magic. I think that it's a very emotive topic. It's one that I, am very passionate about because there just seems so many unnecessary genderings of things, so many unnecessary presumptions and perpetuations of harmful behaviours and beliefs. We can move beyond this, right? We can move beyond this. And the important thing to know is that, your practice is your own. How you want to practice is your own. You have that freedom. So none of this is an attack on your own practice. It's a highlighting. As I say, I think we all need to get comfortable with feeling a little bit uncomfortable because that's where our growth, those growing pains, that's where we can grow out of any kind of harmful behaviours. Well, I've got an exciting little concept for you in terms of the magical thing to do. We're going to look at colour magic, and one in particular that hasn't really seemed to be mentioned before, not I've seen anyway. We've done the magical theory, let's do the magical thing. Okay, witches, here's our magical thing to do. So we're going to take a little look at the 1978 Pride flag, and I made a little discovery here which I was really excited to share about a year ago now, and I'm sharing it again here to perhaps a wider audience. So looking at the 1978 flag, why would you want to do that? Well, the original flag has really a bunch of colour correspondences that as witches and practitioners we can use ourselves. Now, originally the flag had 2 extra colours. The colours, each one has its own meaning. So we've got hot pink for sex and sexuality, red for life, orange for healing, yellow for sunlight, green for nature, indigo for serenity, and violet for spirit. And that other extra colour, as well as hot pink, is turquoise. Terry Pratchett wrote a book, The Colour of Magic, and we can really say from this that the colour of magic is turquoise. This is a great correspondence to use as a queer witch, to really use it as a form of celebration, as a correspondence. And what was great about this is when I discovered this, I made a meme about a year ago now at least, and I shared it out there, and I was speaking with the wonderful Siren from Millennial Incantations about turquoise being a correspondence that you could use as a queer witch. And what was wonderful was they did a really moving ritual on the anniversary of Stonewall, and they used they did a little shout out to me. They used a turquoise candle, and I just thought that was really beautiful. And it's something that I've been very proud of because it was the first thing that I'd kind of given to witchcraft. I've taken a lot of information in. I've consumed a lot of works and ideas, and this was an idea of myself that I could put out there. So I really would hope this makes some traction. I'm going to remake the meme, perhaps a little bit nicer than my original kind of quite crude one, perhaps. But yeah, do try and share this if you can. Credit the channel; it would be very much appreciated. As far as I know, I haven't seen this in any of the queer books that I've been reading. I haven't seen it in any blogs. I've Googled it deliberately to see, like, someone must be talking about turquoise being the colour correspondence for magic, but no one is. And so this may well be an original idea, which I'm really excited about, and I'm putting out there into the world for queer practitioners to assume and to use as a source of pride and as a correspondence. Now, with most of my spells, I will put a turquoise candle in there as a real boost to represent magic itself and to represent my queerness and be proud of that. So this is really something that I think is a valuable tool that we can all use, regardless of who we are, but it's particularly, something that queer witches may well be pleased to use. So when we're looking at these correspondences, what we've really got here is an opportunity to think about what can we do with this, right? What can we do in terms of pride? And Pride Month is one of those things that we see a lot of focus around the flag. And I thought what would be great is, through the month, we could perhaps do different spell workings for the different colours of the flag itself. So hot pink, which as we know was excluded from the original flag because of a lack of dye. Turquoise was because of the way that the flag hung and evening things out to just make it a little bit more symmetrical. We know that with hot pink meaning sex, we could perhaps do a sex magic spell, either by ourselves, with a partner, or if we're asexual, maybe we want to just do a self-love spell. That's perfectly valid in itself. With red representing life, according to Gilbert Baker, we've got the vitality spell that we could do, right? So maybe we want to do a spell that encourages a bit of oomph, it gives ourselves a little bit of a pick-me-up. With orange, it represents healing, and healing spell right there is in the name, isn't it? We could do a healing spell for ourselves, for others, for perhaps our trauma from queer or homophobia, anything like that. We could do a healing spell for others, perhaps people who aren't necessarily as privileged as we are. And you've got your yellow here for sunlight. Well, sunlight we associate with abundance, prosperity, so why not get in a prosperity spell? Perhaps we could gift something to a queer charity. Perhaps we could do something in terms of prosperity just for the community itself or for ourselves. With green being nature, we can make an offering to the land, whether you're in a city and it's just a street tree sitting there, they all count, whether it's a bit more of a sacred space to you. I mean, everything is a sacred space. I have a street tree that I make offerings to, which is just as important to me as a grove would be. With turquoise obviously meaning magic itself, and this is from gilbertbaker.com if you're looking for a source for this. It does also come up as art, but gilbertbaker.com only mentions magic, so, I think that's really the key attribute here. Make some queer art if you want to incorporate the art side of it, or do your favourite spell. Really get into magic itself and the joy of it. I think that's the key thing here. With indigo, meaning serenity, this might be a good time to do a cleansing or grounding ritual, maybe a release, maintaining our serenity, protecting ourselves, a little bit of a hunkering down kind of spell here, if you like. And with violet being spirit, well, let's connect ourselves to some queer ancestors, shall we? Let's celebrate them. Let's make some offerings there, perhaps. And maybe we'll celebrate queer elders. Perhaps we'll pop them on the altar for the month of June, or just for a certain period of time, or on the day of Stonewall, which was the 28th of June 1969. So with all this, it just gives us this opportunity to get a bit more in depth with the pride flag, not just as a pair of pants to wear or as a hat or as some funny sunglasses, but actually something really solidly meaningful. And whilst these original meanings may not be the same as how we interpret them as magicians or as witches or as practitioners, we can still use this as queer witches and witches in general for these wonderful associations, getting in some practical spell work alongside honouring our heritage as queer folk. So hopefully this really gives you some good ideas on, how to go about a bit of magic, especially in June. I think it's really cool as well to incorporate not just the colour magic, but think about maybe incenses, think about inks, think about, certain sigils you could make, perhaps with the letter of each of these, colours or anything like that. Really go in depth and, just continue to be proud of yourself. you know, if you can't do this right now in terms of being open, maybe you're in the closet, you know, with that, I would say it's worth maybe using colour magic perhaps in terms of your clothing, right? Something that can be done more subtly. And, you know, these are all things, again, that aren't specifically queer, but you could do these again to, you know, really get in there. And so I think get involved, get on with, you know, your craft. Don't hesitate to give it a bit of a queering. You know, the reality is queering happens when there isn't that representation there. And so we have to sometimes carve our own path. We have to wave our flag and really get out there and express ourselves. So, yeah. I really want to see your opinions on this, especially on the turquoise thing. I would love to know if someone else has mentioned this. As I say, I haven't seen it myself, and it is a source of, as I say, pride for me. So, yeah, I would love to hear conversations around that and a sharing of that, getting some traction on that. So, yeah, enjoy Pride Month. Love to all my queer folk and to all folk, and let's hope that the years ahead progress nicely and consistently for everybody. Till next time, health and wealth.